We encourage you to hit the subscribe button right now so you can listen to more podcasts of Operation Truth. Ladies and gentlemen, we do want to hear from you, so we encourage you to email us directly at operationtruthofficial@gmail.com. I want you to know that your messages are likely to be heard, addressed, and listened to on air.
Operation Truth, the show they don't want you to see. Now, here's your host, Lou.
Hi, everyone. This is Lou Palumbo. This is Operation Truth, and with me, as always, is my co-host, Tom Fuentes. I remind everyone of Tom's background because it has significance. It gives a lot of validity as to what he says and a clear understanding of his journey. He was a former assistant director of the FBI. Among assignments, he coordinated the entire International Operations Division for the FBI, as well as organized crime and a lot of other rather interesting career endeavors. In a conversation I had with Tom earlier today, he made mention that some of our viewers have commented about the fact that we speak about this immigration issue, as I have for almost 3 years now consistently, and that it's just redundant. I think part of the message that you're missing is we're trying to stimulate the mindset of the American public to wrap their arms around the gravity of this situation. And as I've said before, starting with about 3 years ago, this would take hold on our country, and it's translating into something that is less than pleasant all across the country, but in particular in some of our major cities like Chicago, New York, Seattle, Denver. There's a number of cities. Last week, so everybody understands, one of our major cities emptied out an entire enrollment of a high school. I'll tell you which high school it was, James Madison High School in Brooklyn, and replaced that student body with migrants, illegal immigrants. They're having a problem housing them now that the winter is rolling in. And right now, he has well in excess of 150,000 illegal immigrants in the city of New York. I don't know what's so difficult to understand about the need to talk about this topic on a daily basis. For some reason, the American public, I am concerned, is not getting the memo here. Interestingly enough, as I've said before, redundantly, the largest voices in opposition right now seem to be elected Democrats. Chicago, New York, El Paso, Texas's mayor, the governor of Arizona, Hobbs, who has the Yuma sector of Arizona with the largest contingency of illegal immigrants accessing our country. This is a criminal offense, by the way. I don't think we mentioned that enough. The other part of this discussion, which is quite troubling, and maybe if we say it enough, everyone will start to talk amongst each other and wrap your arms around the problem. We are not checking anyone coming into this country. There isn't a database to reference. We don't have the assets, and I remind everyone on a daily basis, they change their driver's licenses, passports, birth certificates, and last week, we had a gentleman show up at the gate soliciting a news media outlet to help them get into the country, holding a New York State identification card. How I know what it was? I happen to have one. The cameraman with this journalist was able to pan the card as this person attempting to access the country was holding it. It said New York State identification card. I recognized it immediately. I don't know how many times you have to hear this, but you got to sit up and take notice, because if you don't think this is going to impact you, even in the suburbs, you are grossly mistaken. In a state like New York, which I'm all too familiar with, they have attempted to take the migrants and transplant them into contiguous counties such as Nassau and Suffolk and Westchester. They all push back, because they are not sanctuary jurisdictions. New York City is a sanctuary jurisdiction, as the mayor, Eric Adams, reminded us about 15 months ago, where New York City is a sanctuary city. Everybody's welcome. We take care of everyone. I don't think he understood the gravity of this problem that I've been trying to warn everyone about. You cannot speak to this topic sufficiently. We are literally disrupting our major cities and depriving other demographics, such as the minorities in Chicago, from obtaining the aid earmarked for them, because it's being diverted to the illegal immigrants. And by the way, I've said this before, hear me again. We're doing a disservice to the illegal immigrants accessing this country. It's that simple. Number of things pushing on us today. This is just one of them. Something else I had a conversation with Tom and the producer about, which is quite troubling. Apparently, we're in a negotiation with our government, and what it's attached to is acquiescing on this request to give another $65 billion to the Ukraine, this corrupt entity, in order for us to get funding to address our border. I'm only asking, are you kidding? It sounds, I mean, it's worse than it even sounds, but please understand what's going on. We can't secure our southern border because we won't give the Ukraine another $65 billion. And I'm going to ask Tom to kind of jump in on this conversation because he's intimately knowledgeable as to exactly where that money's going. And you're going to be shocked to hear where it's going. And Tom will further elaborate on the corrupt nature, not just of Burisma, the company that the vice president's son worked for, the president's son worked for, but this government in totality. And Tom's going to bring you up to speed on an individual that just died in custody in Ukraine. Tom, you have the floor, sir.
Well, Lou, I don't know where to start with how bad things have been with Ukraine. I think to really be accurate, we have to go back to when Joe Biden and the Biden crime family was receiving millions of dollars from Ukraine. And an FBI informant reported in 2020, going on 4 years ago, that the Biden administration, there were 17 recorded phone calls with Hunter Biden, 3 with Joe Biden, talking about the delivery of millions of dollars to their LLCs, which they could then, in a circuitous manner, move the money around to try to make it hard to find. And in fact, the source tells the FBI that the Ukrainians were saying, with all of this movement of the money, it'll take them 10 years to figure that out. Well, it's taken a couple of years, but it's been figured out now how much came in and how it went to almost every member of the Biden family, including grandchildren. So you have that money coming in. Now, where that matters is, I think, because of that level of corruption, that Joe Biden, now as president, is just about required to pay money back to the Ukraine. And that's the aid that we're sending them. We run their country. We fund their civilian agencies. We fund their pension funds, their health care, everything, in addition to the military hardware that we have sent them at the expense of depleting our own supplies should we ever need that. So in any event, I think that, to me, with almost 30 years as an FBI agent, this is corruption 101. A politician takes money from somebody, a business, a gangster, whoever it might be, and then they need to pay it back. So when they get elected, when they're in position and they call for the favor to be returned, they have to return it. It's their requirement. And I think that's what we see, I believe, in my opinion alone, that Joe Biden is paying back the masters being the corrupt Ukrainians that gave him, the corrupt Joe Biden, the money or his family in the first place. And so now whenever Zelensky or anybody from Ukraine says, oh, we need 10 billion, 50 billion, 100 billion, he better send it because they've got the recordings of how he took the money. And right now, the Republican committees have copies of the wire transfers of the money coming to the Biden family, not just from Ukraine, but from China, from Romania, from the mayor's wife of Moscow in Russia. They have recorded, they have the receipts. They've got the paper showing the transfers. So, and yet you still have Democrats, going on and saying, oh, we don't believe that. What? There's no evidence that money went. Are you kidding me? Are you blind, deaf, dumb, and stupid? Besides being a loyal Democrat. So in any event, I think that what we're seeing now is Joe Biden says, I need to send 65 billion more dollars to the Ukraine, even though all the military experts, not the ones on board at the Pentagon, but many of the retired military commanders who are being interviewed all the time are saying, this war is lost. Ukraine has lost the war. They have no chance of defeating the Russians, of going into Moscow and effecting regime change, removing Putin from office. That's not going to happen. But meantime, we're going to keep sending money to them no matter what. And I think Biden wants that money to go, and his loyal Democrat followers, like a herd of rats, are backing him up in this because he'll be exposed as the corrupt politician he is, should he not send the money.
You know, Tom, I want to ask you a question, if I may, about this leader in the Ukraine. My perception of him is he's not quite the Robin Hood that we would like everyone to think that he is. You reported to me, Tom, that a journalist in custody in the Ukraine recently expired within the past day or so. Elaborate a little further on that individual, number one. And number two, the tactics that are being employed by Zelensky, which should be alarming to the public, because I don't know why we're rubbing elbows with this guy. I don't know where we see this alignment, but, you know, in a broader sense, Tom, and I'm going to have you answer this question also. Do you believe that the safety and the security of this nation has been compromised? Let me hit you first with the first one, regards to this journalist who's been in their jails because I guess he spoke out against Zelensky, and the fact that he's passed away at a rather young age. I'm curious to know what our State Department has to say about this, but what's going on with that, Tom?
Well, so far, State Department or the president have said nothing during the time he's been locked up. His name is Gonzalo Lira. He's actually an American born of ancestry from Chile, but so he's a U.S. citizen born in this country, in the United States. He goes to Ukraine working as a reporter, and he puts out some reports criticizing what Zelensky and the Ukrainian government are doing. Now, in Ukraine, you don't criticize the government or you get locked up. Doesn't matter who you are. So Zelensky has him locked up. And then later, there's some saying whether he escaped or was released a short time, but he got picked up again, put back in jail. Now, his family claims from the first time he was in that they beat him, mistreated him badly, and they believe, without direct evidence right now, but they believe that his death this past week in Ukrainian jail was either murder or mistreatment or neglect. But in any event, very suspicious that he would die. He's in his 40s. There didn't seem to be any other indication of a disease that he was dying of, let's say. But in any event, the pattern for Zelensky, it's so amazing. People in our country, you go back 2 years, 3 years ago, Zelensky is like George Washington of our country. He's like Winston Churchill of the UK. He is a hero. He is the great. All of our politicians are displaying Ukrainian flags on their desks, on their walls, in front of their houses. Meantime, since he got into power, he's practically abolished the Christian church in the Ukraine. The church there is mainly Orthodox. It's actually the birthplace, Kiev, of the Orthodox Christian church. And he basically shut down the church, locked up priests and nuns because he was trying to eliminate the church, locked up their reporters, closed down TV stations and newspapers if they dared to criticize him. So this guy is not the George Washington of anywhere. He's more like Joseph Stalin running that country. And, everybody here just thinks he's the greatest because many of our people are either misinformed or just plain stupid. But, he is not the hero of anywhere. In the meantime, they've got this situation where you don't have free press. And then our media, of course, just thinks he's the greatest. So they don't want to report any of the bad news, whether it's on the battlefield or in the running of their government or any other issue regarding Ukraine.
I want to say something to you, Tom, about one of our candidates running for president currently. And ironically, she is probably the most electable of anybody running for this office on both sides of the aisle. It's Nikki Haley. And for those who didn't watch the primary debates, during the second one, I believe it was, and through an exchange with this young man, Ramaswamy, she pointed out to the fact that the Ukraine was a cornerstone to the United States, which is a rather alarming statement. I'm trying to reconcile what that would be based in. Now, you happen to have brought up the fact that she left office basically penniless, and she's worth about $8 million now. And that piggybacks a comment made by Ramaswamy that she's involved with this military industrial complex and some of her big donors who are loaded to the gills. But that causes concern, because the one thing we don't need is another politician that wants to jump into this proxy war, for lack of better identification, at the expense of the American taxpayer. We have a lot of things going on in the country, Tom, that are rather alarming. Right now, we're pandering, as I mentioned earlier, to get money to secure our border, which is predicated on our willingness to give another $65 billion to the Ukraine. I don't know how absurd this is, but it's getting funnier by the day. I don't want to go back into this whole discussion about the immigrants, but just to touch on it, because some new things have popped up last week that I meant to mention earlier when we started the podcast. One has to do with what's going on in Maine. Apparently, they have a 60-unit townhouse type complex that they've just moved completely moved in illegal immigrants. And again, who's paying for that? Gavin Newsom has just authorized payment for healthcare in totality, regardless of age, in the state of California for more than 750,000 people. I'm just curious, who's paying for that? That seems to be the proverbial question that leads into many of these discussions. And as we know, money is the most important thing to Americans because it's how we, enjoy our lifestyle or feed our children. But at some point, this has got to come to an end. And I'm wondering if the only individual that might have the wherewithal to realign a lot of this misalignment is Donald Trump, independent of the fact that he hurt everybody's feelings by being, I would say, less than discreet in some of his language, his rhetoric, how demeaning he's been, and I would say mean-spirited even at times and unnecessarily critical. But independent of the fact that he has terrible bedside manner, he understands this mechanism we've developed and he knows how to address it. And he speaks to things like sealing the border. What sane, rational, reasonable individual would not embrace this notion about sealing the border? He talks about this issue in the Ukraine. He talks about funding the Ukraine. He talks about how NATO is basically taking advantage of us once again, which is an issue he spoke to while he's in office about the disproportionate spending from the United States compared to the rest of NATO as we're protecting NATO from countries they're engaged in commerce with. It just gets crazier and crazier out here. But at some point in time, we need to course correct the country. And something I want to say to everyone that's listening and watching this podcast, the words that you hear Tom say, and I will take this liberty to speak for Tom, would be the same words if these were Republicans doing this. This has no political lens for me. What alarms me the most about this is that we are in the process of compromising the future of our young people here, and we don't skip a beat. Although I will tell you, interestingly enough, I'm starting to hear some people in the media, I don't want to call them journalists because that has some level of legitimacy. Some of these guys sound like game show hosts, but they're suddenly starting to realize our young people are going to inherit this. People on Capitol Hill are starting to realize we're stacking the deck against our young people. Tom, you've got to have sentiment about this. You have grandchildren, am I correct? I know your children are basically grown, but you have grandchildren, am I correct, Tom?
Yeah, correct.
I mean, what's the impact on our grandchildren, our children? What is it that they don't understand? At some point, the bow's
Well, we don't
going
have to
break.
worry about the impact because our grandchildren are going to be living in a Soviet Union style state if the present trends continue. The Marxists have been trying to take over this country for a long time. Most people don't believe it. And it actually goes back about 100 years with the anarchists back during the time of First World War and Woodrow Wilson. And back in 1908, that was the reason the Bureau of Investigation was founded, to go after some of these anarchists. Later, that was transformed into the Federal Bureau of Investigation, going after gangsters as well as dissidents and seditionists and others. But in any event, our young people, right now they're going to inherit what they inherit. And if we don't fix the country, there might not be a country, or there might at least not one that they're going to want to be part of or recognize. And I think that they won't know it until the damage is done and the country is completely totalitarian. Unfortunately, there are a number of young people now that have, drunk the Kool-Aid given to them by our colleges and universities advocating socialism, or politicians like Bernie Sanders, democratic socialism, or whatever. Those are well on the way to being very totalitarian country and a state that we're going to be living in. And it's not going to take the grandchildren growing up and realizing it, or their children. It's going to happen much, much sooner. And it's happening at an alarming rate. Now, Ronald Reagan made the statement during his presidency that we're only one generation away from losing our democracy. And we could be seeing that right now. That generation might be the people that are in power right now, and the congressmen and the people that back up the just corruption of the Biden administration. We haven't seen corruption on this level before. We see, when I was a street agent in Chicago back in the 80s, we had people like the governor Blagojevich later on, they take a few $1,000s improperly into their campaign fund. That's their degree of corruption, 10,000, 20,000. You have tens of millions going into the Biden crime family's bank accounts from all over the world. And, we're looking at this like, it can't be true. People are saying it's not true. And it is true. And nobody wants to accept it. So they don't want to accept that Zelensky's a crook running Ukraine, and we're funding him. Biden funding him because he and the Ukrainian authorities funded the Bidens. So we have this corruption is rampant and severe, and it's so detrimental to the country right now. Never mind our children 10, 20 years from now, right now. We're looking at this. We could be the generation that loses democracy right now.
What's interesting about this also, and I don't have any political liking because my loyalty first and foremost is to the country as a whole, and my grave concern for our young people. Tom, one of the things that I'd like you to comment on are all these shell corporations that were opened up by the Bidens or Joe Biden, which seem to lack purpose or function. And I gather they were used as a means or a mode to move money. I mean, is that correct, Tom? Am I hearing that correct?
Yeah, that's money laundering 101. Create
Thank
these
you.
institutions, and then when the money goes into one, immediately transfer it to another, and then another, and all in circles and back and forth. And that was the statement provided to the FBI by an informant that the Ukrainian official that he had talked to told him they won't be able to figure out for 10 years how we sent the money, where the money went, what kind of routing it went through, and all that. Now, here we are 3 years later, and the House of Representatives committees, Comer's committee, they have the copies of it. Now, part of this started with suspicious activity reports. Now, these are reports that a bank sends in when they see transfers in or out that are suspicious. They write a report. It goes to the Department of Treasury, and the branch there is called FinCEN, Financial Enforcement Network. And then FinCEN has representatives from FBI, DEA, other federal law enforcement, and the people at FinCEN that are detailed there from these agencies decide which agency is best to investigate this particular SAR or group of SARs. And in many of the cases, when it involves corruption, it's going to be the FBI. Or money laundering, it's going to be the FBI and or DEA or IRS. It's going to get investigated by a law enforcement agency. So what's happened here is that people don't realize, go back 1 year. 1 year ago, we have the Republican majority, very slim majority, but a majority, take over the House of Representatives. That means that the Speaker of the House is no longer going to be Nancy Pelosi. It's going to be a Republican. And the Speaker of the House gets to determine which member is on which of the committees and who the committee chairman will be. The party in power will have one of their members will be the chairman of every single committee in the House. Same thing applies in the Senate, but the Senate is still under Democrats, under Schumer. So in the House, you have Jim Jordan, Jamie Comer become committee chairman, and their two committees in less than a year, because this information was coming out during last fall, in less than a year, they have actual physical evidence of the transfers of money that went into the Biden bank accounts. Now, that's amazing considering, having been in law enforcement all these years, when you submit a subpoena to a bank, you want the financial records, the transfer records, or whatever. That could take a long time. It could take months, depending on the bank. It can take a year or more if it's an overseas bank and you're trying to get information on an overseas bank account through our liaison partners around the world. So in this particular case, for the Republican committees to get their hands on the actual documents detailing the transfers of the money to the Bidens, to get it in about 8, 9, 10 months like they did, I think is amazing. And you hear people say, well, how come they haven't done more with that? How come we haven't had more about this? Well, where you been? Because Gomer and Jordan are on cable news and on YouTube interviews practically every day, all during this investigation the past year, showing what they've got, what they've subpoenaed, what they're getting, what they're analyzing, what it's showing all the time. And so, we've had this now for a year. Here we are a year later, and then 1 year short of the next election. And this could all change. People, if the Democrats regained the House, we could see Nancy Pelosi as Speaker of the House again. Every one of the committees then go to a Democrat, and that would be the end of all of it. No more investigations. You haven't heard any of this evidence being gathered during the years of Democratic control of the House of Representatives. You're not hearing it currently with Democratic control in the Senate. So the idea that this evidence would continue to be gathered and available for future either impeachments or prosecutions criminally, it may or may not be available, depending what happens this coming November.
Tom, what this all lends itself to, especially in listening to your critique about the House of Representatives to start with, is we need term limits here. We have to stop this vicious cycle of putting people into power for as long as they'd like to stay, or up until the point they become millionaires comfortably and then can leave and go back into the private sector. But we need term limits here so we can kind of cleanse this system a little bit. Tom, I've said this before. I've said it on air before. Part of what's going on here is the government is capitalizing on the complacency, the indifference, the distrust, the distraction, and maybe even just plain disinterest the American public has. But this is your wake-up call, guys. And Tom and I are not sitting here telling you who to vote for. You got to connect these dots on your own. If you're content with the condition of your borders, support the party that promotes that. If you're content with the condition of your major cities, support the party that promotes that. If you're happy with your economy and the fact that the cost of living has gone up 17.6% since this presidency started, which hasn't been refuted on any level, continue to vote for this political mechanism that employs that. This whole big lie about transitioning to electricity. Only now we're really starting to look into something that I spoke about for the past 2-3 years almost. We're not transitioning into electricity. We're not positioned to. There are now no charging stations for the cars. In addition, the batteries, to mine for the batteries does more to the ecology than polluting the air, which they accuse us of on a daily basis. You can't dispose of the batteries. When the batteries catch fire, you can't extinguish them. This just goes on. Oh, yeah, by the way, before I forget, when you charge them, you got to use fossil fuel. I don't mean to laugh, ladies and gentlemen, but you have to use fossil fuel. This just goes from like insulting your intelligence to just a level of disrespect for us as a populace you can't quantify. I don't know where this all ends up in the end game, but we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, I'm going to talk to you about a gentleman. In fact, I'm going to let Tom talk to you about this gentleman, Clay Higgins. He's a Louisiana congressman. And Tom's got some interesting information for you as a result of this investigation conducted by Clay Higgins in regards to what happened January 6th, this alleged insurrection. I just want to remind everyone, difficult to overthrow the government when you're not armed, number one. And please be rest assured, the government is far better armed than anybody in this populace as an individual. If we, God forbid, got into a standoff, as a whole, I don't know where we're all going to end up, nothing good, but I assure you, this was not an insurrection. This is just another catchphrase to get your attention, to make you think something went on there that didn't. Did people step beyond their boundaries? They absolutely did. Should there be accountability? There absolutely should, but there's more to this story. We're going to give it to you as soon as we come back.
Hi, everyone. I am TJ Stone, the producer of Operation Truth, and I'm just taking a moment here to remind you to go follow us at Operation Truth Official on TikTok, and you can find us at Operation Truth Official on Facebook. We're on Instagram. We don't do as much on Instagram for reasons. On X, formerly known as Twitter, you can find us at Operation Truth and the number 7, Operation Truth 7, and always email us at operationtruthofficial@gmail.com. Be a part of this conversation. Join the operation.
We're back, ladies and gentlemen. This is Operation Truth. I remind you, please converse with us. Become part of this conversation. Tell people to please listen to what we're saying. We're trying to direct this country in a direction that's going to be more fruitful, primarily for our young people. When we broke off last time, I was bringing up the fact that we have a Louisiana congressman by the name of Clay Higgins, that Tom is quite familiar with, who's, I would say, uncovered some rather interesting information, factually driven, in regards to the FBI's participation in the January 6th insurrection. In fact, probably the only people carrying guns in the crowd were the FBI agents. Tom, I want to go to you with this. What have you heard about this? What's the follow-up?
Well, first of all, an extensive interview of Clay Higgins was just conducted by Tucker Carlson and put out on the Tucker Carlson network. So that's just within the past week that interview went out. Now, what Congressman Higgins says is that he was involved in doing the investigation of what actually happened on January 6th, who did it, how'd they do it. And he said that, the investigation of the groups from all over the country that were going to take buses and cars and trains and come to Washington on January 6th to protest, that the FBI already had undercover sources or undercover agents embedded in many of those groups for going up to maybe a year. And we're well aware.
May I interrupt you, sir? I want to establish something that you'll be able to validate. Isn't it a common practice of the FBI to infiltrate groups, Tom? Not just people going there, drug cartels, drug groups. You understand where I'm going with this?
Well,
Tom?
I'd like to say yes, it's a common practice, except didn't look like they did it with Antifa or Black Lives Matter during the mostly peaceful riots of 2020, when so many cities were burned and so many police officers were severely injured. But didn't look like they infiltrated then. But anyway, according to Clay Higgins, that they did infiltrate what these groups were doing. They had agents wearing Trump gear and hats and paraphernalia embedded with those groups, as they came to DC for the January 6th protests. Now, in addition, what he says is that, in his opinion, there were many FBI agents on the day of January 6th already placed inside the Capitol. And the reason he believes that is, he says, in his 7 years as a congressman, he still gets lost in the Capitol. He can't move around to go from one person's office to another without a guide to tell him. As he said, isn't it interesting that when these intruders come into the Capitol, there's people inside wearing the Trump paraphernalia saying, "Come with me, follow me," and they get directed to the office of Nancy Pelosi and get taken in there. And he's saying he couldn't find Nancy Pelosi's office if he tried. It's not labeled. There's no number. You have to know that that's her office. And how did these guys that were protesters allegedly be able to take the group of protesters and find her office and other chambers within the Capitol building that he said are very difficult to find? You would have to know they're there to be able to get there. But in any event, going back to the beginning of this whole thing with January 6th, the word insurrection from day one was selected on purpose to describe it. It wasn't a riot, it wasn't a protest, it wasn't any of those. It was an insurrection. And the reason, I think, is the Democrats were taking advantage of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, passed in 1868, 3 years after the end of the Civil War. And that amendment uses the word insurrection to say that if someone had engaged in an insurrection against the United States, they were ineligible to run for a national office. Now, that's why it was selected. And the idea was that after the North and the South are reunited after the end of the Civil War, many of the Civil War Confederate generals were very popular in the South. And the fear was they're going to come back. They're going to get elected to the House or to the Senate and be holding national office again, because many of the people in the South still thought, were still upset that the Confederacy did not win the war, and that some of these people, whether it was Robert E. Lee or James Longstreet or Pickett or many of the other generals that gained fame during the Civil War, might run for office and get elected. So the idea of that section of the 14th Amendment using the exact word, insurrection, was to prevent that from happening. They could not run for office. And now you see this, why they want to use that word to try to prevent Donald Trump from getting on the ballot in Colorado, Maine, or other states that are considering it, because of the insurrection that they're accusing him of directing. Now, getting back to Clay Higgins, what he's saying is that he believes, and he has seen documentation from court cases, that there were undercover agents, undercover FBI informants, and other law enforcement undercover personnel embedded in the group that went into the Capitol, the alleged insurrection on January 6th. Now, he says that, many of those files are sealed because they were information that came out during the prosecution of now 1,000 J6 members, but where information had come out of, that maybe that there was an entrapment issue or a setup of them, those files are sealed as part of the court record. He thinks they're going to be coming public in the near future, and that will show, in his opinion, as many as 200 FBI agents and informants were embedded in the January 6th protest crowd.
Tom, it's incredibly important that investigation conducted by Higgins move forward, let me say it to you that way, because it'll have an impact on many of the individuals who were prosecuted and subsequently incarcerated. I don't want to get into the entrapment laws today with you, but it sounds like they were creating an environment for people to engage in illegal activity. Tom, when I mentioned earlier about the FBI and its practice, and not just the FBI, local law enforcement agencies like New York City Police Department, LAPD, ATF, they infiltrate gang groups, drug groups, white supremacist groups. This is just a common practice, partly how they gather intel and track their activities and are able to head them off at the pass, so to speak, but not for anything. Like, let's say we had 10,000 people converge on Washington, D.C. On that day of the insurrection. I'm just curious, do people really think that you could overthrow this government with 10,000 people? Is that your reality-based understanding of how it would happen? I don't think we could overthrow the government under any circumstances. I think you could walk away from the government in a form of secession, right? Or fracture, however you want to do it. It's just that we seem to be consistently creating these catchphrases or these false narratives to skew the thinking of the American public. What is the problem with just telling people the truth, independent of your political belief? It's just amazing that every time we brush up next to a topic, the Democrats cannot ever find merit in the argument of the other side. And I go back to Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton, over oral copulation, committed a felony sitting in the West Wing of the White House, and not a single Democrat thought he's not fit to be president. Look, Donald Trump's no camper. By the way, I worked for a lot of people that high up in the food chain. None of them are. They adopt a different set of rules. They seem to think they have that empowerment or prerogative. And by the way, we also empower them. We do this with this entertainment industry of ours. We give them far too much prerogative. This whole thing is just skewed. But at some point, I'm hoping morality and conscience become part of the conversations of our elected officials and people in the media. And you know what? We don't talk enough about the poison the media spews, how biased they are. I listen to all these channels, Tom, MSNBC, Fox, CNN. There are weak links in all of these chains. You know, at one time, I used to find enjoyment watching MSNBC, the morning show, because it seemed to be a give and take, a back and forth, and conversations, and it was an open dialogue. I'm listening to this guy, Joe Scarborough. I don't like insulting anybody. He sounds like an imbecile. But the comments and the critiques he makes of Donald Trump and the fears we have that we're going to have a dictatorship. You know, stop selling fear. I'm in a business where I protect people for a living. I never sell them fear. I talk them down so they can relax. When are we going to let the American public relax? You know, guys, I think we're going to wrap the show for today. When we come back for the next podcast, we're going to have a discussion about this gun control, which, I hate to say it to you, is going in the opposite direction of the what they want, is all I can say. I don't know what they're thinking about. When we come back to the podcast, we're going to continue this conversation about our borders, because you can't hear it enough. Maybe if we beat you over the head enough, you'll understand why we're doing it. If you're not raised up, if you're not concerned, if you don't think there's a problem, go to Chicago, go to New York, go to San Ysidro on the border of Southern California. Take a trip to the Yuma sector. Go to the 1,000-mile border in Texas and take a good look at what's going on. By the way, we're also going to talk about what's going on with Texas and the federal government. Texas most recently employed the National Guard, and they will not allow the Border Patrol to become involved in anything dealing with the migration process. Geez, I wonder why. And by the way, just so you can all rest tonight, I heard from the Director of Homeland Security, Mayorga, the border is secure, so rest well. Ignore everything else going on in the country. That's just a figment of your imagination. This has been Operation Truth. I can never thank Tom enough for his wisdom and his words, his insight. And please know, Tom is not a Republican and not a Democrat first. He's an American, just like myself. We're just trying to help change this conversation, take this country in a different direction. We're not seeking elected office. We're just trying to give you the benefit of our journey, what we've learned here, how to problem solve. All of these things we talk about on this podcast, sadly, have easy fixes to them, whether it's the crime in your major cities, your border, your energy sector, your foreign policies, which we didn't delve into enough in this podcast, which we need to remind everyone. This is just tragic what was done in Afghanistan. You can't speak to it enough, mostly because how we left these women and these young girls out in the cold, putting them back in the hands of Taliban and the Al-Qaeda. Guys, Operation Truth Official at gmail.com is how you can communicate with Tom and myself. To the individuals that think we're beating this horse into the ground with immigration, boy, are you wrong. You're just not getting the memo. But keep listening to us, because we're not here to offend you. We're here to build a bridge to the truth, something that we've abandoned. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time. This has been Operation Truth. Tom and I both thank you for your attendance.